Hello, and thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this annual Psychology Day at the UN. I feel really honored to be presenting alongside so many esteemed colleagues. I'll be presenting a clinical psychology perspective on the climate crisis, considering the ways we can work with our emotions and build psychological resilience. As a clinician, I often think of myself as a professional listener of sorts, and I reflect a lot on the importance of listening. In the face of the enormity and the complexity of what's going on in the climate and environmental crisis, we really need to listen to a variety of inputs, numerous voices, and perspectives to face the challenges. So to begin with, I think it's essential that we listen to what's happening on the earth and understand the intersecting environmental crises that are occurring, starting with greenhouse gas emissions, which we know is leading to a warming planet. There's also deforestation, which reduces carbon capture. Biodiversity loss is embedded in these intersecting crises, and that means harms to numerous ecosystems. There's the sixth mass extinction, devastating loss of species in our world. We also see soil degradation, soil loss, soil erosion, which is impacting the health of crops. Fresh water depletion is occurring, which is leading to water scarcity and drought. There's also ocean acidification, the disruption of the ecosystems of our seas. All of these have multiple impacts that are embedded and amplifying of each other. We also need to listen to those who are already suffering and try to understand the intersectional socio-political harms that are embedded in the climate and environmental crisis. We do know that ecological destruction and social injustices such as colonialism and systemic racism have often very similar roots. These include attitudes of domination, of exploitation, of extraction, and a lack of awareness of our interconnection. Along with these intersectional harms that are occurring are inequities in climate impact. So those who are contributing the least to the problem and who have the fewest resources for coping are experiencing the greatest climate harms. And that's really horrible to consider how much inequality is embedded in the climate crisis. In this way, we will be in the same storm, but in very different boats. We need to also listen to experts, including scientists who are doing the research and providing us with data from which we can learn and understand the magnitude of what's happening. We also need to listen to those who are trying to make change, who are working together to come up with solutions and face the numerous challenges that are embedded in the climate emergency. Some examples of this include the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. In their most recent report in February of this year, it was a really urgent assessment. They described the magnitude of what's occurring, that destruction is affecting billions of people throughout the world already and will continue to amplify. They also described the embedded levels of injustice that are part of the climate crisis, as I was just describing, and how much inequity and marginalization are entailed. What was very useful was that they described the tools and solutions that we have to move forward in equitable and sustainable ways, but that this will require that we really transform our way of life substantially. And so this is really quite daunting and quite urgent. There's also the Conference of the Parties. The most recent was COP26 in Glasgow in 2021 in the fall. Delegates from almost 200 nations came together. And again, this is an attempt to forge new ways forward that address the problems. The stark reality that we need to reduce our carbon emissions by 45% by the year 2030, which is, it's so hard to even contemplate how we could do that. That's just what we need to keep alive the 1.5 degree goal of the Paris Agreement. The Glasgow Climate Pact came up with numerous pledges from countries on how to reduce many of the harms and to boost cooperation among nations. And we'll need to continue to put pressure on all the parties to be able to meet those pledges. We also need to listen to young people, those who are facing a foreshortened future. And I wanted to cite this recent large-scale survey of young people ages 16 to 25 across 10 countries. It was quite sobering to hear their responses to climate inaction. 83% of these young people said that they believe people have failed to take care of our planet. Almost half of them reported difficulties in their daily functioning. Levels of distress, not surprisingly, were highest in those already experiencing direct impacts of climate change. And over half of these young people reported various distressing emotions and even said that they felt that humanity is doomed. So it's quite a lot to take in. We also need to listen to the numerous mental health impacts. We do know that existing health and mental health vulnerabilities are exacerbated in the face of climate change. So, for example, as temperatures rise, we see increased levels of violence and decreased cognitive capacities. For folks who are living in degraded environments and suffering various kinds of environmental injustice, like higher levels of pollution, degraded environments, lack of green spaces, we see increased levels of depression, anxiety, and grief. And we know from extreme weather events like wildfires, floods, droughts, there are all kinds of traumatic responses, post-traumatic stress, loss of identity, a loss of a sense of security. So mental health impacts really get amplified. So after outlining all that we need to listen to, what are the psychological barriers that we face to engaging with the urgency and necessity that is required? Why do we tend to bury our heads in the sand, turn away from the enormity of this problem? One concept I have found helpful with this is Timothy Morton's idea of the hyperobject. He said that global warming and the climate emergency are hyperobjects, which are defined as things that are massively distributed in time and space relative to human. These are experiences so enormous we can't see the contours, we're embedded in the problem, so it's just overwhelming to even contemplate. In relation to a hyperobject, we often have a trauma response because it goes beyond our capacity to adequately cope. It's just too enormous. We also know that there are psychological defense mechanisms, ways that our minds and our psyches protect us from feeling overwhelmed. And defense mechanisms are useful and necessary, but when they become overutilized or rigidified, they prevent us from fully engaging with our feelings and then engaging with the problem itself. One such defense mechanism that I think we see with a lot of prevalence in the climate crisis is disavowal. And that is that strategy where we know the reality, we know the difficult truth on one level, but we push it out of our minds. What's useful is knowing that we can dismantle defenses, we can help to soften them, but it takes compassion and support to be able to face these underlying painful emotions. So here's where we consider what psychology has to offer. And I think of this in terms of managing distress and helping us stay open to the truth. As we come out of disavowal. We often see a variety of kinds of traumatic stress. And I'll start by describing pre-traumatic stress, which was my colleague Lisa Van Susteren's idea of the stress felt by people not yet experiencing the direct impacts of climate-related events and change, but feeling anticipatory distress, often referred to as eco-distress, eco-grief, eco-anxiety. We also see what's defined as disenfranchised grief. That's a grief for a loss that has not yet occurred. For most kinds of grief, we have rituals for mourning, but for a loss that has not yet happened, there are no rituals, and that makes it really hard to process the emotional experience. We should also consider that pre-traumatic stress may reflect an aspect of privilege for those who've not yet faced any kind of existential threat. It's real nonetheless, and something that can be helped by processing the emotions, talking with others, joining with others, and taking action. Another kind of traumatic stress is what we most commonly think of, the acute traumatic stress, the post-traumatic stress that occurs as a reaction to an extreme weather event or acute climate disruption. This could include wildfires, droughts, hurricanes, floods. And here we need interventions that include community sources of help, disaster response, ongoing trauma treatment of various kinds. There's also pervasive or ongoing trauma resulting in what Eagle and Kaminer call continuous traumatic stress. This is from continual ongoing climate disruptions, various forms of environmental injustice, toxic exposures like high levels of pollution, and embedded psychosocial traumas like systemic racism. What's difficult about continuous traumatic stress is rather than a discrete event that can resolve and we can get past and then face in the aftermath, this kind of trauma is ongoing and pervasive and really requires systemic changes, community supports, elevation of community leaders who understand the culture and the community and can provide leadership. So I want to shift now to talking about how do we build psychological resilience. And here I often use the idea of our psyches as emotional ecosystems that need to find sources of sustainability. So in this way, if we get too out of balance, we can't function adequately and with a sense of wellness. So we really need to find sustainable resilience practices. When we think of resilience, it's also important to not just consider getting back to business as usual, because the business that brought us to the brink of this kind of crisis is not what we want to continue. We want to find new ways and aim to foster stronger capacities. In this way, we consider forms of post-traumatic growth. So to build emotional resilience, I think about working with our emotions and helping to move us from tears and distress to experiences of hope and courage. To do so, we need to work with the emotions in a variety of ways. First, we need to identify and face those difficult emotions. We need to find ways to cope with those emotions and then to transform those emotions into something useful. So to identify the difficult emotions, it's first important to recognize them as expectable, reasonable, understandable, and often even useful. Here I've listed a variety of kinds of emotional distress that we see in the face of the climate crisis. They exist on a continuum in terms of level of intensity and severity. They often coexist and can even include a numbing or desensitization or paralysis. To work with the emotions, we need some form of emotional engagement as well as regulation of those emotions. So we want to make room to process, to validate what feels painful, Often that helps to do in the presence of a supportive other or a group of others. We do know that becoming unsettled can challenge us to grow, and so it's useful in that way. And we want to really consider the ways that positive emotions can sit alongside our distress, and we can try to cultivate some positive emotions. Dan Siegel had the idea of the window of tolerance, which I find really useful. So that's finding the emotional range where we don't feel overly distressed, but we're also not under distressed or suppressing our emotions in self-protection, finding that middle ground where we really can engage and work with our feelings. One way to do that is to calm our nervous systems. We know that when we experience threat, whether anticipatory or more directly, we can have sympathetic nervous system arousal. That's that fight, flight, or freeze response. So we need to find ways to bring on calming of the nervous system. I listed some of those strategies here: meditation, mindfulness, breathing, deep breathing practices, listening to music, going in nature, and so on. Another resilience strategy comes from Bob Doppelt, who's done a lot of work on individual and community transformational resilience, and he calls this purposing. And it's kind of what it sounds like, finding a sense of purpose and meaning in the face of difficulty. Often this entails honoring one's values, thinking about our ethical principles, our spiritual grounding that gives us purpose and meaning. It also can include building optimism. And here I use the definition from positive psychology that optimism is focusing on what we can control rather than dwelling on the many things that we have no control over. Purposing, of course, includes taking useful action, and that can mean starting with individual behavior change, joining with those in our neighborhoods and communities to create important change and action, and building from there. This relates to the next resilience strategy, which is building connection and a sense of community. We do know that with all kinds of stress, social support is incredibly helpful in mitigating the worst of it. Sally Weintraub, a climate psychology colleague in the UK, describes the need to foster a culture of care. When we take action with others, we build a sense of solidarity. We don't feel so alone. And we do know that social tipping points can happen as we build social momentum. Gigantic change can occur that was not expected previously. Another resilience strategy that often gets overlooked is our need for replenishment. Again, going back to my idea of the emotional ecosystem, we can't just deplete all of our emotional resources. I've talked to many climate activists, climate scientists that are frantically trying to work on the problem, but not taking the time for good self-care, getting enough sleep, eating well, getting exercise. Creativity is another replenishment strategy that brings enormous pleasure. Spiritual practices can be really grounding and cultivating joy wherever we can. Another source of resilience is focusing on our sense of interbeing. This is Thich Nhat Hanh's idea of our connection with all beings across the planet. So any practice that connects us to the land, to the more than human, as well as to other human beings, can be really stabilizing in our lives. We can also learn lessons from natural ecosystems that emphasize the health in diversity, in reciprocity, and in interconnection. And my last idea for resilience is learning from the wisdom of those who have already been suffering. There is so much knowledge and wisdom and understanding from those communities who have been suffering, but who have found ways forward. So we really need to listen. And I'll end with this quote by James Baldwin: "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." And I thank you so much for listening to me today and to be willing to face what's so difficult. Thank you.